Welcome, everyone. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us for today's webinar hosted by ASF and FAFTS about the recent news about the Tyndall study. I'm Ryan Fisher. I'm Chief Operating Officer of FAST. I joined the organization just a little over 3 months ago. Prior to joining FAST, I spent 2 decades in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, working for PPMD in patient advocacy and patient-focused drug development. I'm humbled and honored to now be a part of the AS community. So I'm joined today by my co-host and co-moderator, Amanda Moore, CEO of ASF, and our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Barry Kravis, who Amanda will introduce in just a moment. So just some logistics to start out. We received a number of questions for today's discussion with Dr. Barry Kravis. As you know, we did request a community webinar with Roche, but the request was declined, and instead Roche responded in written format to those questions, which we've posted online as of yesterday. So we will discuss and reflect on some of those responses today. We're continuing to send Roche the additional questions that are being submitted and request responses and advocate on all your behalf. So for today, you'll notice a chat function, a Q&A function on your screen. You can feel free to submit questions during the webinar. We'll try to get as many live questions as possible, but we received a lot of questions prior to today's discussion, so we're going to try to address as many of those first. If we don't get your question answered, we'll be following up after the webinar. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my co-moderator. I also want to thank Amanda for working together to get today's meeting set up and collaborating on this. So Amanda's going to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and welcome to the community. We're so happy to have you. I'm sure most of you know our guest today, but we'd be remiss not to introduce her to the community. We're so thankful to have Dr. Elizabeth Barry Kravis being with us today. She's a professor of pediatrics and neurological science and biochemistry at Roche Medical Center. She also is the lead of many, many rare disease clinics there, including the Angelman Syndrome Clinic and a future FAST Translational Center of Excellence. So she joins us today based on her extensive background in clinical trials, not only in Angelman syndrome, but also in other multiple rare diseases. So I just want to remind everyone, and just out of respect for Dr. Kravis, she is not speaking on behalf of any industry of Roche or anyone else. She is here because we feel that she has a lot of knowledge and understanding of this process and what we are currently going through and experiencing as a community. And we felt like it was really important to have a conversation with her. And as Ryan already said, please feel free to give us your additional questions. As myself or Ryan have been getting them, we are submitting them back to Roche and trying to get them out to you as we receive them. And we're committed to continue to do that. So let's just dive right in today. And Ryan, I'm going to pass it back to you for the first question.
Wonderful. Thank you. So it's been a hard couple of weeks for this community, in particular those who were in the study. So first, Dr. Barry Kravis, tell us how families are doing that you're in touch with. This has really been difficult news, and people heard from different, channels, social media, et cetera. So how are they doing, and what sort of questions are you getting?
Yeah, I think most families were not too happy to hear the news. Obviously, it's very hard to call families and tell them this kind of thing. I think, the first couple families we talked to, it was, I was delivering the news to them, and we were talking about how they could manage their situation because no announcements had been made yet. And we were told by Roche to tell families that were at our site that week ahead of time, ahead of other families. But then as things just kind of broke out, a lot of our families did hear about Roche pulling out from social media, and then before I had a chance to get to them, because this is not a short call with a family where you just say, oh, Roche is pulling out. It's a call where you want to be able to go over all the options. You want to explain a little bit about why Roche is pulling out. You want to talk about their child. And of course, most families were immediately reflecting back on some of the things that they felt had improved during the trial and wanted to talk about, whether they would see regression. And that's a really painful thought, and we went through this once before with the genetic study in our 5 patients who we did have to watch regress. And we don't really want to have to do it again, and I have more patients this time in the Roche study. So I think it's painful for everyone. And I think kind of the way it rolled out was painful, in terms of my interactions with my patients, where some of them are emailing me going, why haven't you called us yet? It's because, okay, I was told by Roche not to call you until X time. And then now it's out and I just didn't have a chance to call you. And I think this caught some of the investigators off, we just didn't have time to communicate before the decision was communicated. And I think overall Roche could have handled that better. But, we had the same thing when they pulled out of Down syndrome and Fragile X syndrome. So it's not really all that surprising. But we're here to support the families, and we know it's not easy for anybody.
Yeah, no, I agree. And often these things may come out via press release and the different time zones, and no matter what, it's never easy. And I think the uncertainty around it after the news comes out is one of the most difficult parts.
Right.
We're trying to navigate that. Thank you for that. Amanda?
Well, and we appreciate obviously the care that you have towards our families, because that's our number one priority at both foundations, is that support. So I'm curious, in your opinion, did the trial closure have any broader implications on the impact on other trials or on patient care?
Well, so I don't think that this trial closing has not thus far had really any impact on the Ionis or the Ultragenyx programs with the ASOs. They're moving forward exactly as planned. I mean, I think there have been the question of whether patients can move from Tangelo to those other trials, and I don't think it's not going to happen in the phase 1-2 trials, because there just isn't enough time. Those studies are going to be filled relatively quickly. And whether anyone could get into the Ultragenyx trial from Tangelo will depend on the half-life decision at Ultragenyx, which hasn't happened yet. But the trials that are currently going on, there's been no impact, really no impact on patient care either. Although I think many families are looking to the future and what's going to happen after February, and are we going to need to adjust patient care based on the withdrawal from ASOs. And we already know really from both studies that, and even we've had long wait times during the studies, and I'm not going to focus on any one because we basically seen the same thing in all 3 of them, that if you go too long and start to come off the ASO, you can see regression in sleep, regression in behavior, and sometimes even kind of a flurry of seizures that looks a little bit like drug withdrawal. And so in those cases, we will have to treat the patients as those symptoms come up. So there could be some, adjustments to patient care, but those are going to be down the line, as people are coming off their last ASO dose, which is we're talking, spring or summer of 2024, assuming there's no partner and that actually happens. And then facing the loss of skills is another thing that we actually did have to go through in the genetics trial, and there's kind of not much to do about that. So I think yes, there could be an impact on patient care down the line, but right now we aren't really seeing anything that is different from what we would typically be doing in terms of management.
When I think the good news is knowing that so far it's still steady on course for the other 2 companies, but also knowing that, our clinicians are already talking about what care looks like for these families and how we support them through navigating through that if and when that does happen. So we appreciate that. Ryan?
Yeah, and talking a bit about those families who have been within this trial, Roche did state within their Q&A this recommended 9.5-month washout period for moving to another study. I'm assuming that's another ASO rather than any study. Could you just comment on this based on this response from the company in terms of the washout?
Yeah, so Roche has been a bit up and down on that washout because they actually have a Logobat going on, and they've announced that the washout period is 15 months for a Logobat based on a presumed 12-week half-life of the drug. And the typical thing when you're switching or when you're coming off a drug to go in a trial is you wait 5 half-lives. That's like a standard mantra of clinical trials. And so but Roche just published a paper in June, which says that the half-life of their ASO, it quotes it as 6 to 7 weeks in the paper. Now, we know that this varies with what species you're looking at the ASO in and the brain region where the ASO is working. So, so there's going to be variation with respect to that. And so it means that theoretically, if assuming the half-life is around 7 weeks, that 9.5 months is giving room for the 5 half-lives to occur. And so it's not really a 12-week half-life as someone may have heard if they were talking about trying to go in the Logobat study. That's a number that other companies could use and decide to accept Tangelo patients after the washout period, which would be the 5 half-lives. I don't think anyone is going to take Tangelo patients before at least 5 half-lives. And the reason for that is that they have to protect their trial. You can imagine if you took someone into a trial of an ASO and they had already had benefit from another ASO, you can only see a partial response from that person. And so, you know, even if you go right with the 5 half-lives, we don't actually know what the true time course of a clinical gain is. So we can look at the drug half-life, but what if a person improves their ability to walk and we don't know if they're going to, you know, lose that gain right at the time the ASO comes out, or if it's going to take, if you've rewired some neurons, it may take more time for that to undo itself. So in other words, the clinical gains may have more than a 5 half-life time to go away. And then if we enrolled those patients into, say, a phase 3 trial, we could compromise our results from that trial. And that would be the worst thing we could do, because what the real goal here is to have the optimize our phase 3 trials. We must not compromise those, because we have to run the best trial to get access for everyone. That has to be our biggest priority. So I think it's going to be a very careful decision, and Ultragenyx released a letter today, and they emailed me separately saying they haven't made a decision on what the washout period will be, but because they really need to kind of look at the science and make the best decision based on that science. And that really is the way to approach it, because the worst thing we would want is for, you know, to have patients who are partially treated get in a trial and then compromise a phase 3 result. And we can't let that happen in our field. And I know it's painful because people are all thinking of their own individual child, which of course I would be doing if I was the parent. But, you know, but we do have to look at a broader picture here, and so do the companies. I do not believe Ionis will let people who are ever treated with an ASO into their trials. We tried to approach them about this with the earlier genetics patients, and that was the position. So, I mean, and they're really just trying to run the most stringent trial possible.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, have you seen companies in other disease spaces possibly do like almost a sub-study of a cohort like this, where it's not part of the main analysis of the trial, but provide access to a subset of those patients?
Yeah, that's interesting. That may have gone on in some ultra rare diseases. I don't know, but I can't think right off the top of my head of a specific instance of that. I think there are some situations where those patients have not been considered part of the trial itself, but have had a separate open label access, or even a separate expanded access program where they could get access to drug, but weren't considered in the primary results of the trial because it wasn't clear how much their results would be contaminated by a prior exposure.
Okay, great. And we're going to talk a little bit later about that date that was issued around the February 2024 and questions from patients. Okay, Amanda, next question for you.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the conversations that we've had for years now, but specifically when we got this news, was around the different outcome measures and markers that we are using in these trials, and are they the right ones for our Angelman population? So I want to talk a little bit specifically about the EEG and what we know about this marker. Roche stated that they saw encouraging results with this, yet insufficient to meet their internal threshold for moving to the next stage. Can you talk a little bit about, in general, what we know about the EEG and why data may be encouraging yet not sufficient enough to move to the next phase?
Yeah, so we have this delta power measure on EEG, which has been worked on by many for a long time and has been published in a number of articles. That's clearly an abnormality in people with Angelman syndrome. And actually, there's been nice studies that show that the delta power abnormality corresponds with the level of function of the person with Angelman syndrome as measured by the Bailey and the Vineland. So that other disease groups are envious of this EEG marker. Actually, sometimes you don't have nearly as clean an EEG marker as Angelman syndrome has. So this is actually a very powerful tool as a predictor that you're getting into the brain, which is called target engagement, that you're getting to the brain and you're doing something to the cells that's making them function more normally. And so that's good. And often the biomarker improvement often heralds later clinical improvement. I mean, we know that Angelman syndrome is a developmental disorder. And so the opportunity to see developmental change may not be right away. It may take years and years for us to know how much an ASO can truly impact different individuals with Angelman syndrome that come in, to be treated at different ages and different levels of function. So, but the EEG tells us, okay, hey, it's getting into the brain and it's normalizing a basic electrophysiologic process that's not normal in Angelman syndrome. So it's very positive to have good signs on the biomarker, but it doesn't tell you for sure that you're going to meet your clinical goals, although the fact that there's a correlation between the EEG biomarker in this case and the clinical status of patients it makes it a very valuable outcome. But in the short term, it can be, harder to know. And I think that EEG is not the reason why Roche would make a decision like this. I mean, in general, a company would not make a decision about ending a program because they didn't think their biomarker result was good enough. That would be unusual. I think it's a global picture of different things that go into this. I mean, we all know that Roche wanted to have a 6-month dosing interval, and that 6-month dosing interval, some of the families in the trial know, was problematic because people, kind of started to show signs of coming off drug towards the end of it. And we've discussed this with Roche, and we've discussed it at other meetings. And so I think it was an issue with not, meeting expectations in terms of dosing frequency. I think the outcome measures are, and we're going to discuss that later, I know, but there's a bit of challenge in terms of, does the Bailey pick up everything? Mm-hmm. And this is a discussion we've had surrounding all the studies. And so what Roche was looking at, the totality of it, we can't exactly know, but I think the EEG is basically a good result and is something they can use potentially to find a partner, and I think there's a larger picture in terms of why they pulled out.
Well, and just to follow up, I know we have received this question quite often, and I think the question's actually in the question box right now. We have asked, because I think a lot of families are trying to understand, every company has these different internal thresholds and what that even looks like and what those are. Yeah. And so we have asked Roche about this. So we are committed to let the community know if Roche is willing to share some of that with us, we will share it back, because I think every organization or company is going to have those different internal thresholds.
Right. And I think we have to remember that Roche is a very large company that's developing products for all different diseases and organ systems. And so, the things they're going to push forward have to land at the top of their list, and that there may be a large number of criteria involved in that. So it's not, like some of our other companies we're working with, like Ultragenics is a smaller company and they only have so many irons in the fire, and they're maybe going to be more sort of devoted to this specific disease as opposed to Roche, which, as they have said, have a large portfolio that they have to consider. So decisions are made at the top of the company sometimes that even the study team wouldn't, necessarily is unhappy about.
Sure, absolutely. Ryan?
Yeah, and we've even seen this with those that are earlier stages of development, PTC's recent news, where they said it wasn't the science, but they prioritized their portfolio. But it's really hard, no matter how you slice it. I think it's really hard for the community to hear anytime these things happen. So, okay, so importantly, we asked Roche what happens to the data from the study. Will it be provided to each family? Are you planning to present the recent findings at meetings, publications? What's the timing? They did respond that they're planning to share study results with the scientific and patient community via several channels, including manuscripts, lay summaries, in conjunction with a future external partner. So I think that leaves a lot of vagueness in terms of timing. But more importantly, I think there's ambiguity around whether families get individual patient level data of their own child. So are you able to comment on that in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I have actually never in any clinical trial seen families get individual data on their own child. You can get individual data on your own child, for instance, from a natural history study. In fact, we try to give families feedback and write like a feedback letter telling you how your child did on assessments and those studies. But I have actually never seen individual data come back on the individual child. Now, the investigators have the data. In some cases, we had permission from Novartis actually to release some of that information to families, the information that we collected during one of the Fragile X trials. That was a specific request that we wanted to release a specific thing. I think that so some of those things can happen in a very specific basis, but releasing the testing results on that child out of the company is just something I would not expect families are going to get that. I do not think Roche is going to release that. I think we're pushing Roche. I know Amanda has worked a lot on this. They're pushing Roche to enter data into Ladder, and Roche has said that they're going to enter the baseline data into Ladder. Whether they'll enter the other data, I think is something it's too premature to know. Roche is looking for a partner right now, and while they're looking for a partner, they're going to be everything is going to be not released. So I wouldn't expect they're going to do any presentations at ASF or FAST, because those are still in the time frame where they're looking for a partner. So nothing is coming out right away, but they have stated both to their investigators and publicly that they plan ultimately to present the data and write up the results of Tangelo for publication. But the timing of that will not be, and then of course, if there is a partner, then that's going to depend on the partner. So I think the timing of that is unknown, hopefully within the next several years.
Yeah, that's hard to swallow. I mean, I think we all know that this is literally the blood, sweat, and tears of this community when it comes to participating in these trials. And this data is so important to informing future drug development. I think as a collective community, we have to push and advocate for data sharing, responsible data sharing. But so much that was done with this study, and I hope those families that are listening know that you truly have helped move us forward by your participation to understanding of drug development in AS. So we can't thank you enough for that, but we know that it's really hard to hear that it may take a couple of years. So Amanda?
Yeah, I think that, for me personally, the last couple of weeks, it's just reflecting on what lessons we've learned through this whole process and what we need to do as a community to one, ensure that we get something across the finish line, but also look at all of those lessons and learn from them. So I'm curious, from your perspective, were there any lessons learned from this trial closure that can inform future research and trials that we really need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have learned a few things. I think, having been through similar issues in the Fragile X field, we had some ways of responding to that. I think, first of all, it's very important that large companies listen to their investigators. And I think in this case, either that wasn't always happening, or it was, there were larger company decisions that we don't have control of. Don't get stuck on a particular characteristic of your product that you think is going to be the way it's going to roll out even before doing a phase 1-2 trial. You have to be flexible in study design in rare disease. You have to be able to turn, look what Ultragenyx did. They had a horrible side effect and they were able to turn on a dime, lower doses, go out to other countries when the FDA was a big problem for them. And then now they're, and gradually they've come back, and now they're through the FDA again and ready to go again. And that's because of being flexible, being able to revamp the whole thing, being able to say, okay, if we have to start from zero and do this differently, that's how we're going to do it. I feel like there were times when maybe there could have been more of that at Roche, but it's again, a large company has a lot of priorities, and you don't have that kind of flexibility sometimes. But one of the things we've done in the Fragile X field, when we think a company is not doing what we would advise from the clinical scientists, we have a clinical trials committee now that will get together, and we have actually told companies to go packing in Fragile X, and we've just said scientifically you're not approaching this right. And I think that I know we have a committee in name, but we don't meet a lot, and there might need to be a strengthening of that. Because in the Fragile X field, if a company does not get endorsed by the Fragile X Clinical Trials Committee, none of the 32 Fragile X clinics will run their trial in the USA. And so we have had a lot of strength in terms of kind of forcing them to do things that we know are right, but that they may be, kind of not wanting to do. Mm-hmm. So I think that there will be lessons learned. And we're going to talk about outcome measures next, so I'm not going to talk about that now, but there will be lessons learned. And I think one thing that the community could do is perhaps have a stronger body to advise industry and kind of force that on industry. I don't know any better way to say it.
Yeah.
I think it was well said. And I think message to the companies, listen to your patient communities, listen to your investigators. These are folks that know this best, and we want to be partners in the process.
Absolutely. I think, oh, sorry, Ryan.
Please.
No, I was just going to say, I agree. I think that the structure is there. And I think that this is one of the big lessons learned on how we can have more of a louder voice when it comes to especially some of the trial designs and what that looks like. And so I think that is something that we as advocacy groups and the Ladder Learning Network can move together and jointly push a lot harder as we engage with industry moving forward.
And this was my experience in Duchenne as well. It was sort of learnings over time and adapting over time. But sort of this effort, this pre-competitive effort of collaborators within our drug development ecosystem to work together as much in harmony to move drug development forward and learn from those lessons, and then hopefully do better the next time. So the big question of current outcome measures and biomarkers in these studies, there are some concerns about the current measures and limitations, and I just wanted I know it's a large question, but your general thoughts on the current instruments that we're utilizing within these studies.
I think, so I think the EEG biomarker is good. It's almost as good as you get in a neurodevelopmental disorder. And I think if we could measure UBE3A in spinal fluid, that would be even nicer. We think that Biogen can do that, but, we await more data. So in that area, the biomarker area, I think, as a field, it's pretty strong in Angelman syndrome, but these drugs are not going to get approved on the basis of biomarkers. Biomarkers are very helpful in terms of, should we go forward? Are we seeing a signal? Are we getting target engagement? Mm-hmm. But they're not going to result in approval, at least in the FDA as we know it. So we need a clinical outcome that shows improvement. And we all know, we have known from the beginning, we took the Bailey because it's validated and it's kind of the best thing we have, but we all know it's not perfect. We all know that sometimes the Angelman kid can do a lot of stuff that they don't demonstrate on the Bailey because they didn't sleep last night, because they were in the hotel or whatever. So we know it's not the perfect instrument, and it's also not on the Bailey are not all the items that we see improve in Angelman syndrome. And the great example of that is that if you walk 10 steps on the Bailey, you get walking. And to go to the next level, you have to like jump or run or do something like that. So walking 12 steps and sitting down and wanting your stroller gets the same rating on the Bailey as walking all over New York City on vacation for several hours. And so we know that there's a huge clinically meaningful difference between those things, but we don't measure it. And so we know there are things that we don't measure. I think we were all hoping that the Bailey would be enough, and it may well be enough. It's just that we don't know all the Bailey data that Roche has looked at, and we don't know, and we also don't know what would happen with the Bailey if you followed it much longer and had more consistent dosing for a longer period of time. You might be able to see very good changes on the Bailey. In the short term, it's not the most wonderful measure on earth, but it is a validated thing that we have. So what could we do to make that better? Well, we've already done some of that in the area of language, where the ORCA was developed because it was clear that the Bailey and the Vineland were not granular enough to pick up those small changes in communication that we can see in Angelman syndrome that are meaningful, but not necessarily detected by a very big score change on the Bailey or the Vineland. So we have that in one area. We don't necessarily have it in other areas. There's certain things where that walking, for instance, could be detected by wearing like the Actimyo, or now called the Side, where you wear the walking measure and it tells you how long did you walk in a day. And so we have the Bailey may need to be supported by other measures that actually do detect change in more granular kinds of ways. So that's one issue. I think another issue is they're just things that are skipped. Like if you go from being a death risk because you're an Angelman patient and you love water and you would walk right in it and drown happy, and you go from not being able to hold your breath in water or swim to being able to swim across a pool without any floaties on, that does not get you any points on the Bailey or the Vineland. If you get toilet trained, that gets you some points on the Vineland, but not any points on the Bailey. So there are some very clinically meaningful outcomes that are just not on the radar for these instruments. One thing we've thought about doing, and I've actually talked about this with some of the Roche study team. I've had some families who've sent me timelines of when did they see the clinically meaningful gains that their child had during one of these studies. And of course, this is open label data, so it would never be something that would, be valid at FDA or for or for approval or anything. But why are these timelines helpful to us? Because we can take that timeline and we can mark which things are detected on the measures we're using and which things are not detected on the measures we're using. So that might be a very valuable way of pulling out what are the gaps, what are we missing, why are the families feeling that there's improvement and then the Bailey's not showing us that. I think there's work to be done in that area, just because this is kind of we're first having, this is the first slew of clinical trials that's really using the Bailey, and it could go down in smoke like some of the early Fragile X measures. And then we had to rethink it and say, hey, wait, what were we missing? So this provides us an opportunity to ask those questions, I think, of patients who were actually in an ASO trial. And I need to get it straightened out with Roche, whether this is officially study data or not. But I do think there's a huge amount of value for the families telling us what happened when, and which of those things was really clinically meaningful to you, and which of those things do we actually detect on our outcome measures or not. So I think there is work we as a community could do to fill the gaps. And then I think there's also going to be work at the FDA, because if I have a patient who is who improved in their gross motor skills, and I have another patient who improved in their fine motor skills, and I have a different patient who improved in their communication skills. And the FDA tells me, and I've got 50 patients that are all improving in different areas. The FDA tells me you have to pick the one domain of the Bailey, what's going to be your primary outcome. Then if I pick the one domain, I'm going to get the 12% of patients that improved on that domain, and I'm going to miss all the patients that improved on the other domain. So that makes it very challenging. And so we have work to do to figure out with FDA, how do we capture the entire Angelman syndrome in a primary outcome without having to pick one specific little area? Because that we already know from Fragile X, that's not a successful strategy to pick one area of the disease and try to just look at that. We have to come up with some novel ways of being able to look across the disease. That's my opinion. That's not anything specific to any company.
Yeah, no, and I think as we're in this new era of patient-focused drug development and the FDA being willing to listen to the voice of the patient and caregiver, I think we do have to push collectively on ensuring that we're contextualizing what's actually happening, where these measures don't show you what may be truly meaningful to a family at the end of the day. And this is a problem in rare disease, across rare diseases.
Yes.
Often rare diseases are taking on measures that were designed even for other conditions and adapting them. But I think there is an avenue here for advocacy when it comes to the agency, so they fully understand how you think and feel about these emerging therapies and the impact and the potential impact of therapies. So that's an action item for this community. Okay, Amanda?
Yeah, so I want to shift our focus specifically just for this question to the families that that participated in this trial and took that risk and spent a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of exhaustion, a lot of tears, a lot of fear to participate in this. And they've been told that they can stay on the trial drug up until February of 2024. And we've already talked a little bit about what the fears are for those families on what happens when that drug goes away. But I'm curious from your opinion, outside of, nothing has been settled. So it's about managing expectations a little bit here, but what options may be available to these families based on your own experience, on other trials outside of Angelman syndrome?
Yeah. So one of the things that we're doing within the trial is we know that the end is the end of February. So we're trying to optimize the number of doses that every person gets and the amount of drug people get. And so that depends on your own individual dosing schedule. And we've been over that with a lot of our families, just to give people as much as possible. I think if they do find a partner, that this is going to be maybe less of an issue. Although we don't know the partner will continue Tangelo, but it is a little hard for me to imagine that a partner would take on the program and not continue Tangelo. Mm-hmm. That would be unusual. I haven't seen that in a rare disease where there was an ongoing trial that was taken over by a new partner and they canceled the ongoing trial. I just haven't seen that as an example in rare disease. So I think if they get a partner, there's going to be probably ongoing dosing, but we have that uncertainty until December. So we don't know if there's going to be a partner. And then in December, there's going to be an announcement. We have had other trials that have failed for various reasons. In some cases, the drug has worked, but the trial has failed. And that's very easy to do in rare disease, believe me. And so there have been various things that have happened. Sometimes the drug has been acquired by another company, but the other company doesn't have enough money to have a drug development program, but they've agreed to provide the drug to those who are on it currently while they accrue old data and try to go to the FDA with that old data. I don't think that's going to be an option in this case, but sometimes those companies have made the drug available through expanded access. Sometimes there's a situation where the drug, things kind of go on hold, and then a new company has taken it up years later, and then they've opened a new trial and they've made drug available to some of the patients who are in the old trial. I think all those things have happened. One of the things that has happened in our Niemann-Pick work is that patients who, when the trial ended, patients were allowed to move into an expanded access program, and that can be an option really for any drug development program where if there's perceived benefit, but the company is getting out for some other reason, especially money, then sometimes the drug can be made available through expanded access. I have asked Roche about this question. I don't expect an answer until after we hear about the partner. So that's not a question we're going to have an answer to until the winter. It wouldn't be, I just don't know what they'll do with that question at all. But I do have to say that if people get drug through expanded access, what has to happen is the company has to be willing to give the drug to some FDA compliant distribution center, and then they distribute it. Someone has to run the expanded access. I've done this for multi-site projects and other diseases. I would be willing to do it. It's not it's not sort of the gravy train is over, because expanded access bills your insurance for your treatment and your, anesthesia and whatever, and you don't have any travel money. So I just want to, it's challenging. We've done it in Niemann-Pick type C. We've actually found ways to support families for travel through one of the parent foundations. And we have had families with more resources have donated money to Roche to be able to treat families whose insurance won't come here. So I will tell you, there are ways within the community to support the rest of the community when that happens. But again, I think this is a completely open question, and we have no assurity that this can be an option because Roche definitely has to agree to it, and we have to then navigate the FDA. These are just what can happen.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's a lot of people in the Q&A box asking the question, how likely is it that there's going to be a partner? I don't think that's anything that we can actually answer. I know that Roche is trying to work really, really hard on it to try to find a partner. But Ryan and I can commit that when we hear anything, we will make sure to be transparent with the community and let them know. And one other thing that's come up that I think it might be important for you just to shed some light on is this idea of a lot of people want to know like what families saw, like what you saw. Can you kind of talk a little bit about why there may not be a benefit right now to be able to share kind of that information of what you saw and what families saw? We're not really supposed to share clinical trial data. And the truth is that the data goes into the database, and I don't actually have the Bailey data or the Vineland data. And I have seen very little clinical data, even, under confidentiality. I have very little of that. So what the group data looks like, I really don't know. We do know what our individual families are telling us, and we know, some of the anecdotes we tell. We know from the genetic study that they presented some of their patients, and we know that in a lot of cases we see improvements in sleep. It's the same kinds of things as what genetics is presenting without saying anything specific to any given family. I think the one thing I can say for sure is I think there are things that families are seeing that may not be detected on the outcome measures. And I think an autopsy or an analysis of that might be helpful to the community in terms of future trial design. Well, thank you for addressing that. I appreciate it. Ryan.
Yeah, and just to follow up on a potential partner, you had mentioned there might be questions on dose and dosing and sort of how high dose. Would we assume that this new partner would have to interrogate that before moving to the next study? And that's a big question for this.
I think based on the now published half-life of the drug, the dosing needs to be more frequent. I think, we've had inklings of that for quite some time. And I think the new partner would have to do studies that would be needed, in terms of long-term toxicity to be able to dose the drug more frequently, because the FDA in general, with anything, the FDA will require studies to support a dosing change. And so if we wanted to give the dose more frequently, and this is something that I think is interesting in the Angelman field. So when we first started the genetic study, If you had told me that when we got to a dose that was starting to show something, that we would see changes that patients would report to us in 2 or 3 weeks, I would have told you, you're crazy. That's all placebo effect. There's no way that could possibly happen. But then I had videos, and so I think whatever UBE3A does in neurons, which we don't totally understand, we're seeing more rapid change than we expected to ever see, which might mean that there's more sensitivity, like the whole thing operates on a shorter time frame than we ever would have expected. So this idea of very extended dosing periods might not be specific to the Roche ASO. It might just be a general principle of UBE3A and Angelman syndrome. I mean, you don't see it in SMA because you're looking at these very, very, very long-term outcomes of gross motor development. But when in Angelman, we've got sleep and we've got behavior that really goes up and down a lot and is more sensitive. So that's an emerging concept, I think, that we have learned in part from these long dosing intervals when people are waiting to get on to the long-term extension or people are waiting for a bridging dose. So I think we need to pay attention to what we're seeing and act on that. But a new company, I think one principle is that all of the investigators would believe that the new company should dose more frequently to get an optimal study, and they would probably have to do studies to support that.
There was a question about route of administration as well. And do you believe that there's potential to change that route of administration to achieve more enhanced benefit? Any comments on that?
So
ICV.
ASOs that go to the brain cannot be delivered IV because they don't cross the blood-brain barrier. They're very negatively charged, and that's not compatible with crossing the blood-brain barrier. I guess the question could be whether if we gave them, through a port centrally into the ventricle, they would work better. And so far, I don't think studies have really suggested the distribution of the ASOs is usually pretty good, actually, in studies that most of the studies show that a lot of the ASO does get up to the brain. ASO seem to be able to do that relatively well. So I don't think the route of administration is going to be changing.
All right. Thank you for the question. Okay, so you have experience now with clinical trials in AS, and if you were speaking to companies in general, based on adapting learnings, what advice do you have for them regarding just even the family experience of trials, which can be very difficult processes? Is there any general advice for companies that are planning and conducting trials in AS?
Yeah, I mean, I think dosing timing is very important. I think we're all learning from this. I think any thought that dosing timing would be longer than 3 or 4 months should be out the window. And that's something that in general, we would advise other companies that have a drug with a similar half-life that's an ASO. I think that is a key learning. And, there may be elements of there may be some benefit to more frequent timing. I also think that it's important for companies to listen to what the families are saying. I don't know a family that would not be willing to come in for infusions more often if the drug would work better. Okay. And so I think the fact that this idea that, we can reduce the family's burden by having less frequent infusions. Sure, you can, if it's going to work as well, if you give it every 6 months, but there's no family that would pick less burden and less effect. Everyone is going to pick having a better effect and having more frequent dosing. So I think that's something that needs to be communicated well to companies that, and we know this from the NPC field where families come in every 2 weeks for their infusions. If their kid is not going to lose function, they're going to be there every 2 weeks. And we're not talking about every 2 weeks in Angelman. We're talking about every 3 or 4 months and maybe even every 2 months. But I think if it's going to work better, no one's going to mind that burden so much. I think we need to keep thinking about outcomes, and all of the companies need to keep thinking about outcomes. And I think we need to think about, using the validated measures, but supporting them with other measures that have more granularity to pick up things in Angelman syndrome, like the ORCA and the Actimio and things like that. So I do think we're going to have a lot of learnings and that we have to take forward, and they're mainly going to be in the area of, how do you do the dosing and how do you do the outcomes? I also think there was some pain in the Roche study related to all those MRIs. And I think also getting rid of things that really aren't needed is another thing that we have to work with companies on. Think about it. Do you really need this? Even if and even if the FDA is telling you they want this, is there a way of discussing that with FDA and ameliorating it? Because it's not, it may be not picking up, something that is a safety problem. Although you could argue you have to do a bunch of those tests before you know it's not a safety problem. But I also think that there's a global maybe need for consistency. I mean, we have 3 different studies that we know have different requirements from the FDA. And why is that, since they're the same studies? And I think that's something that the community can discuss with industry going forward, and even with FDA is what's the right thing to require. So those are all things that we're gonna learn downstream. And if we have a representative body, like the Clinical Trials Committee and Fragile X, we may, have more power to kind of implement those things.
Yeah, and continuing to look at some of these observer reported outcomes. I know, just talking to families, that just this experience alone of bringing their child or to the clinic can impact how they perform on a specific measure.
Yes.
I think we need to take all of these things in consideration, that if we're truly going to get the holistic picture of what the impact of these things are, we have to take those things under consideration when viewing them. So I think Amanda has the last question.
Can you imagine an in-home Bailey? I mean, come on.
The problem is that every home is different, and that's gonna,
right?
The administration is not too valid when it's administered in all different places with all.
Well, if you could just administer it in a pool, Jackson will do really well for you. I can tell you that right now. So, well, I'm going to ask our last question because we're running out of time here. But I'd be remiss to not say thank you for spending time with us. And I know Ryan will wrap us up in a minute, but I think FAST and ASF's goal was to get information to the community. We still have a lot of questions as well, and we will continue to push really, really hard to get those questions answered. We have representatives from Ionis and Ultragenyx on the call today, and I just want to thank them for continuing in this space. And hopefully they've heard some really good feedback from you today and community as they continue with their design. And I know that FAST and ASF are committed to supporting them to help them get to the finish line as much as possible. So we've kind of talked about this last question, but I think just to kind of put a bow on it a little bit, in your experience from all the rare diseases that you've worked on, which are quite a lot, do you see some similarities here with our current clinical trials up and downs? Is this typical for a community?
Yeah, I would say that pretty much every rare disease has faced this. This is not the exception, but rather almost the rule. And I know that the Angelman community had a setback with Ovid when they announced their results. Now Roche is pulling out of ASO trials, PTC is pulling out of gene therapy trials. But Angelman is a rare disease, and that's what happens in rare disease. I mean, in Fragile X, and Fragile X is a more common disease than Angelman syndrome. We've pretty much figured out every way to have a clinical trial fail. And in some cases, we're pretty confident the drug worked, but the trial failed. In Niemann-Pick type C, we've also figured out every way to have the FDA not approve a drug. And the barrier just seems so high that we can't get over it. And we just have to keep trying. Down syndrome is another example. So there's actually, this is almost expected in a rare disease, unfortunately. And it comes from the fact that, rare diseases are rare and outcome measures are developed, as Ryan said, for other populations, and we're trying to adapt them to our disease, but they don't perfectly pick up our disease, and they don't perfectly pick up all the things in our disease, because one outcome will be looking at one kind of area and one outcome will be looking at another area. So we don't have the perfect outcome for any of these diseases. So even when we have a trial that works, we miss stuff, and then we don't have the kind of statistical data that the FDA wants. So, and also, companies are dependent on money and different priorities, and it's easy for a rare disease to fall off the priority list for a big company where the market isn't that big and it's just not as huge a priority when they're doing their market analysis. Or it has to be a drug that would be easy to develop if it's going to be a rare disease, or something else is going to trump it. So I think, and then if it's a small company that's really devoted to the disease, you always have the risk, and we've seen this in Fragile X several times, where the company is going to run out of money and then they're not going to be able to carry forward. Or there's a company that's working on a couple of rare diseases like Neuron with Fragile X and Rett syndrome, and one disease gets a little ahead of the other one, and then they go with that disease and the other disease falls off the radar. So there are many reasons for this to happen, and I think the lesson in this is persistence. Persistence. After the big Fragile X mGlu trial failed, I told all the Fragile X families, we're going to win this. It just is a matter of time. We have to find the right ways to measure things, and we have to find drugs that translate well from the mouse to man. And that's going to take persistence. And I actually ran a marathon because that was a symbol of the kind of persistence that rare disease organizations need. At that time, that was my commitment to, hey, we're running a marathon for this. And I think in every rare disease, we're running the marathon, and we don't have everything right at the beginning. But we're going to get there. And every failed trial should be a definite opportunity to learn and do better the next time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is perfectly said. As much as this is heartbreaking for us as parents, and that there's more work, there's still work happening, but the most crucial thing is to take what we have learned and make sure we implement it. So thank you so much, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Barry Kravis, for joining us today in the conversation. We so appreciate your time. We know you have a very busy schedule and for everything you do on behalf of the community. I want to thank Amanda for working together on this webinar.
You too.
We're going to continue to work hard to bring information to this community in a timely fashion. We're going to be pushing companies on transparency and communications. We think the only way forward also is shared learnings. And I've seen this in my own past history in Duchenne, is when we could learn from each other as we are moving through drug development. It's the only way we're going to be advancing to potential therapies. So we're committed to also sharing this information together as news comes out. Amanda and I will be working closely together and do everything to serve this community. So with that, we will be posting the webinar sometime next week, but we thank you all. Please continue to send us your questions. We hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.